Welcome to the Four Corners 912 project discussion on rules of the game. For a country to exist peaceably as a unified people in the game of life, we all must be playing by the same rule. The rules for our country were established in the Constitution that was agreed upon to abide by. This was and is the supreme law of the land.
To follow the rules, you must know what they are. They are few and clear. We hope to help you all to better understand what the rules are, as we are looking to elect new representatives in local and state government offices next year.
They take an oath to uphold the constitutions of both the state and the United States.
What are they to uphold and protect?
We will begin this regular discussion beginning with the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments of the Constitution.
Good morning. Back with the Four Corners 912 rules of the game. We want to start right off with big thank you to those that are sponsoring us. Don Brunson with the Woodman Life Insurance. So you need good insurance, you know where to go. And of course with the White Eagle Antenna Service, you can get free antenna around here if you get an antenna. You can get free TV service around here if you get a good antenna. So check in there and get your antenna up so you can have TV and watch us all the time. Today we're going to be doing a little something new. We have a guest with us today to help us cover the whole idea of these things we've been studying about, hearing about in the news on the city planning code. We're trying to get the code set up for the city of Cortez. There's lots more issues than just the code. Today with us is Charles Jeter, visiting with us, got family here. Who are you?
Well, thank you very much, Dexter, Bud. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored that you decided to address this issue. A little bit about me, I grew up in Mancos as a kid, and really love this area, and probably about 6 or 7 years ago, our family decided to go in and do a partnership with some other people and get a place out here. So I try to make it out here at least 5 or 6 times a year. And right now I'm on break from school at San Diego State University, where my program is Urban Studies and Planning. Before that, I've done a few businesses myself. I've built my own home from the ground up, and that gave me a lot of experience with zoning and compliance and things like that. And I've also been licensed as a private investigator in New Mexico, and even before that, going back about 25 more years, I was in the Navy as an aviation warfare systems operator. So I've been around a few times, and I've seen a few things.
You're not green behind the ears.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not your average student.
All right. Well, one of the things we're concerned about always, these issues that they come up. I don't care whether it's legislation or, in this case, a city code for the local area. Our whole thing that we're based on the rules of the game starts with the foundation of the Constitution. That's where it has to start from. We have to play by some rule. I don't care whether you're playing poker or something else.
That's the playground rules right there.
Yeah,
yep.
And this is the foundation. This is the rule we operate under. So, Bud, bring us up to date on where we're at with what in the Constitution deals with this.
Well, we have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, both of the federal and the state. And like you said, if we don't know what the rules are, how do we know how to play the game?
There you go.
We hear this phrase bandied around about we're a nation of the rule of law rather than the rule of man. Well, the rule of law means our rules of the game, the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is the nugget of the idea of our form of government. And it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. An aside, pursuit of happiness used to say property. The original was life, liberty, and property. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Okay, then after that we formed the U.S. Constitution, and in the preamble it says that we're doing this to secure the blessings of liberty. And in Amendment 5, nor shall you be deprived of life, liberty, or property, there's that phrase again, without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. To reinforce that again in the Colorado Constitution, in the preamble, to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And in Article 2, which is the Colorado Constitution Bill of Rights, Section 3, all persons have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. That's the applicable rules. When we look at these land use codes, we have to keep this in mind, that the property is mine. It does not belong to the government. It does not belong to my neighbor. My neighbor doesn't get to complain about what I do on my property, using the land use code as a weapon, and we see it all the time.
I would like your place to look like mine,
Yeah,
because mine is really the best looking.
mine looks really good.
You know, this is not the first time we hear about trying to design, like in a city, a code so that everything really meets the ideal that somebody thinks it should.
Mm-hmm.
Clear back in olden times, before I was born even, and I'm pretty sure before you were born, Plato, the old man Plato, came up
The
with...
stuff the kids play with?
Not quite. How about Plato?
Oh, okay.
Plato came up with the whole idea of creating a utopian city.
Yep.
A perfect utopian city. I think you told me something about utopian. What
Well,
the word utopia?
Utopia is a conglomerate word derived from Latin, eu and topos. Eu means no or not, and topos means place. So utopia is no place, can't exist.
Well, you sure popped my bubble.
Well, and you know, Plato did that, and then we had, what was his name, back in the 1720s, More, Thomas More, maybe. He wrote a book called Utopia, talking about it's a nice dream, but it cannot happen.
The difference, the utopian concept that Plato and this guy were trying to set up was that perfect, ideal city in society. Our Constitution is based on dispersed authority. These are a centralized authority.
Right.
So our Constitution, between our three parts of government, the individual rights, it's governed by the people, all individuals. We don't have a central authority governing us, where they had a central authority that where there was a city, fathers, that this elite few governed the others. Now this brings us to, what do we got? We've got, we need governing. I don't think we can dispute that. We need some kind of governing to be a civil society. Try to be civil with each other anyway. We need some form of government. Well, we have it through our Constitution, setting the rules. Then part of the rules that's dispersed down to our land. I've got my piece of ground. How do I live with my liberty to live my life as I want to without infringing on your liberty in your place?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So that comes into a land use code. So, Charles, maybe you can bring us that. You've been studying all about this land planning and use.
It's been pretty exciting.
Take it from
when
here.
When you think about land use, people tend to have, everybody has their own ideas. And I use the alliteration of my jacket because that was something that I brought it here today. My flight jacket from the military. And I don't know if you can see this, but essentially it's got a bunch of patches and things on it. And on Christmas morning, I was skiing with my son over at Chicken Creek Ski Area. We'd like to cross-country ski. And a woman came up to me. She's the librarian of Mancos, and she had asked me a few questions, somewhat pointedly, more declarative than questions. And she just made the statement. She just said, "It's too much." My husband has a flight jacket like that, and I told him it's too much too. Aesthetics is that simple. It's what somebody else thinks they should see. And I'm not pointing the finger at anybody because everybody knows we all have those times where we just look at something and say, that's just loud, it clashes, whatever else. But the facts behind me wearing the jacket were quite compound, and she didn't have access to any of those. And that's kind of what we want to look at with land use code planning. It's more like we don't have a central government here. It's not like Paris, France runs all of the different little provinces. This is very, very special and very unique. We have 50 states that are all competing to win in the marketplace of ideas. They're all competing on their slightly different things. The Constitution is what unifies us, as you mentioned before. And all that comes from, like, I'd say probably beyond 1750, but I always like to think of Locke, who's the first person who really kind of articulated the consent to the governed. We're all agreeing here in America to be subject to the Constitution, and we're all agreeing at a smaller scale to be subject to the land use code. It's one of those compacts that we've made. If people want to live in Cortez, then Cortez is going to have a little bit of say in how they do things. Real simple thing. You don't want somebody making fireworks right next door to your preschool.
Well, but you just said,
Yeah.
we don't mind the city government having a little bit of control.
That's the consent to the governed.
Right.
That's the consent to the governed. Now, that has a condition. What we looked at in public administration, I was really fortunate to have some awesome instructors, most of them written textbooks. We had fantastic government employees who came in. I know they're not paid, they're just graduates of the program. And so I got to see a really broad cross-section this past semester. And it really enlightened me to the point where I actually felt like I could approach this issue. And I was honored to have the time to speak on Tuesday, as a matter of fact. But the interesting thing is that everybody has to agree on certain things that seem reasonable at the time, okay? Now, when we make laws, as anybody who's law enforcement, who's post-certified, or even most veterans who've had to deal with rules of engagement, when to shoot and when to not shoot, those have to be crystal clear. And if we approach aesthetics and kind of the fuzzy thing, and we look at it, we try to make that crystal clear, it's extremely difficult. Everybody has a different process and procedure for how they perceive reality. And that's not to be surprised, and we're not trying to shove everybody into square holes and we're all round pegs. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to work where we have discussions, and over time we decide what we want to have. The problem comes in when you have people who say, we think we know what you want, and then they run off for a couple years and come back and say, here's what you want, and we want it done right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where we find ourselves today.
And the folks that do that have the imprimatur of law behind them.
That's the big deal. Code is law once adopted, period. Full
Yep.
stop. And this is the part that really bothered me when I first started looking at this case.
I'm going back to the writing of this code.
Right.
This proposed code had the imprimatur of the force of law because they were acting under the authority of the city government to draft this thing. Now, it's not code yet,
Right.
but they had the backup of existing law to give them the authority to do this.
Correct. And they also had financing. You know, our system is one where you have people who in the executive branch, of course, you know, they execute things, but the legislature votes on the money. And so they had funding that came from city council through some grants. And that allowed them to go ahead and take that time and hire people and come up with what they felt was going to be good code. Now, where things got fuzzy is exactly the process of who's in charge of reviewing that code. Is it the elite? Is it just a few in Cortez? Or is it open to everybody? And then the fuzzier part is, what exactly do you mean by open? You know, and this is where we've run into about 100 years of issues ever since we've gone to Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company back in 1926. And Euclid versus Ambler is what is the foundation of what we call Euclidean zoning, okay? Yep. And that means you've got an industrial area here, and you've got a residential area over here, and you've got commercial areas kind of buffering it in between, so you don't have mostly runoff or air pollution or noise pollution or things that are not in the public interest. And those are things we all define as what is the public interest.
Well, that doesn't bother me so much, since men gathered in communities. We've had zoning codes. There were certain things you could do inside of the walled city. There were certain things you had to do outside of the walled city. So if our modern building code says industrial zone, fine. I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
If you've got a 24-hour operation, it's hard to have that next door to your house.
Right.
Right? You're not going to sleep well.
Right.
But here's where it gets my craw. If you are on the lower end of our society and all you can afford is a 60-foot mobile home, you must live here.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting.
It is. That's what this code says, that if you have a trailer, you can live in this part. It's, what's it called, MH1?
Okay.
In the code, something like that.
And that's the aesthetics part. That's we don't want.
No, it's not aesthetics. It's discrimination and racism. Look at the LA code in 1908 and the New York City code in 1916. Racist documents calling themselves land use codes. Okay?
Right.
That is the basis for what we're doing today. Everybody likes to go back and say, well, here's your background from 1870 or whatever, okay? You can't live past what your great-grandfather did,
Right.
Okay? You in the land use code business, city council, and you can't live past L.A. 1908.
Well, you're hitting.
You can't live past New York City 1916. They are racist and discriminatory, and even they had an ethnic component to them. If you were Italian or Irish, you could not live in certain parts of New York City. I don't care how much money you had.
You directly articulated the flaw and the weakness with Euclidean zoning. That was probably, we couldn't have planned that if we hadn't talked about it. But it was perfect how you brought that up, because that process was called redlining. And I had in my urban theory classes, we specifically dealt with the problems of Euclidean zoning. The end result is that nowadays in the 21st century, we've realized Euclidean zoning has its flaws, and it has strong ones, and they tend to be worst on the people impacted the most, who are either below the poverty level, or they have English as a second language, or any number of ideas. Maybe they have a large family. All of these things play a part, and you nailed it. But I got to tell you, bud, that's very good, because the best way of trying to do zoning is a little bit more blended, a little bit more mixed, and you're trying not to be racist. And that's the funny thing. Euclidean zoning, when you start isolating different things, you start isolating different economic levels. When you start doing that, you're going to start seeing a ripple effect through all of society. And we have a lot of cultures here in Cortez, and we're the shadow of Mesa Verde. This place has been around for probably 1,200 years. People have been here, and I think, if I recall correctly, there were 60,000 people in this area about 1,000 years ago. And so we have about 30,000 maybe in this region. I'm not sure. I'm just kind of spitballing there.
Yeah, that's close enough.
Yeah, so we're just half of the people that we had before. The density we've had in this area has been twice as much before people even had the wheel, or they had domesticated animals, aside from, turkeys and dogs and things like that. So it's fascinating that people could get along on a level that was much more densely together. And I think when you're talking about the flaws of Euclidean zoning, that's exactly why we need to have a lot more input. Because when you get those outreaches, and Cortez has tried to do those things in the past, they just kind of strayed away from that for the last couple of years. They had a good process of trying to do outreach to everybody who was in a disadvantaged community, and also what I count as a minority is business owners, because not everybody can do that. And it doesn't mean just business owners who have a business license. It means the small-time entrepreneur who's assembling things in their garage, or the woman who bakes tamales and then brings them around to businesses, you know, or has a daycare center, you know, and has just a few families, so she can supplement her income while her husband's at work, or if she's a single mom, she can do that while she's raising her kids under 3 years old, right? Those are things that we all accept as part of our community. Those are things that under the Constitution you should be able to do at your residence. You should
Without heavy-handed government regulation.
Correct, and we're trying to understand why regulation makes an impact. The problem is it creates risk. It creates a lot of risk for these people who've actually decided to do something that's outside of the normal Euclidean residential whatever they want to do. And I gave the example, sometimes people like to assemble things in a commercial place, and I use the Goods for the Woods, and Seth, he puts rifles together there. Technically, that would almost be considered, gunsmithing might be considered an industrial art. But it shouldn't require that he get an entirely new zoning code. It shouldn't require that somebody come in and give him a permit just to assemble rifle parts that were machined somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, you have today an increasing number of people that, along what you just said, work from home. That is a burgeoning industry. Well, I can, instead of going down to the office or the business, work on my computer at home and do my business, and even what do you call it, drop shipping
Yep.
business.
Yep. eBay,
Yeah.
Amazon, they're
Yeah.
running their own businesses.
So how's that different than the guy on the street?
You're right.
Why are they not regulated the same?
Right. And that's a good point also, because the issue with regulation is that it constantly lags behind innovation. And so you always get this friction where you have people coming up with great ideas, and they're trying to compete. They're trying to compete in a pretty much the most free market area you can think of. You don't have people who are doing a lot of corrupt things out here. People aren't asking for a payoff like they do in Mexico City or somewhere else just to run a business, right? So
Yes, they do.
right. Well,
It's called a permit fee.
right. Well, and that's
What do you think that is, Charles? Huh? That's a payoff.
well, that's the interesting
I'm
thing.
paying you,
Right.
as the city planner, I'm paying you to approve what I want to do. That's no different than handing a $20 bill to a cop not to give you a speeding ticket.
I understand exactly.
It's not
Yeah.
any different.
I understand exactly, because I was licensed in 1996 or so over in New Mexico, and in Colorado up until 2015, as a private investigator, you didn't have to be licensed. Plenty of people made a plenty good living doing it for, I guess, the next 20 years before they decided to do that just recently. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. Because I had no end of trouble being 23 years old, straight out of the military, and people trying to tell me I didn't have the experience to do what I'd said several times. I had to hit that thing 3 times. So I understand exactly what I felt the pain you're talking about.
Also, I don't know how it figures in, but Cortez in Montezuma County, really more Cortez than the county, but the Cortez is a very surprisingly transient community.
This is a good point. That's a really good point.
People are changing all the time, coming and going. As
Yep.
the rules, zoning, whether it's zoning or whether it's land use codes, they're coming from a whole different setup. And what?
Yep. Well, that's a good point, because I remember being a kid and noticing that things were a little more stable in Dolores and Mancos than they were in Cortez. And I don't think that's changed. We're just at kind of a crossroads right here. And I think probably you go back 1,000 years, same exact thing.
But I think that's partly due just to Cortez being the county seat.
Yeah, the most urban center of the county. That makes sense.
You get that with different governing agencies that their personnel get transferred.
Right.
They move on to a better government job somewhere else, things like that. So I don't think that's abnormal for a county seat.
Correct. And because of that, that's precisely why you need to have well laid out code. You don't want to have something that people are promising, we would never do that to you. We would never do that. we're good people. We're never going to do this. And it's like the hard part of trying to communicate is not about me trusting you. It's about the fact that this code is law once it's adopted. And that's that's I think been the most friction I've seen either between me and some people who are in the planning committee, or between other people who are business owners and the planning committee. And it's led to this kind of psychological phenomenon. They kind of see it as an in group and out group. It's an us versus them. And so once people start getting defensive, sometimes they have that group think happen. And once that happens, they're like, they just don't get it. There's this and this. And they ascribe all these reasons. And I see them in the public record. It kind of breaks my heart. I'm like, you guys aren't looking deep enough. You're just trying to assume why we don't like this. We keep telling you, but then you just cry, no, that's not true. I'm going to think up something different. So the us versus them thing is supposed to be what we prevent by having transparency and by having interaction at every single level of the process. And that's why I recommended that they deny this right now. Turn it down completely, okay? There's no fixing it right now. And in fact, we need to go back to the existing code, and most probably the best course of action is do a data-driven approach and actually look at the code, look at the people who've been trying to enforce this, the code compliance officers. Don't call them on the carpet and try to make them make decisions and politicize it. Just look at the data. It had the data for Cortez. We only have about 8,700 people here. It's a nice little sample, and you can look and see what kind of code violations have been broken and where. And you can anonymize it and just say, oh, 700 block, 800 block, whatever. And once you do that, you could hand that data out to anybody to basically give you feedback. Do we see a lot of these code violations here? And what codes we haven't had violated probably don't belong in there. Just say, look, everybody's seen this as common sense. Until somebody starts breaking these laws, let's get rid of this code because it's poorly written. There's a lot of stuff that makes sense, but it's poorly written. So it's up to the interpretation of people in a transient population in government. Because this is kind of like a stagecoach stop. People come through here, they do 4 or 5 years, and they're on to the next place. You know, we don't have a lot of people. You know, I want to live here. When I get out of school, I want to live here. The wage doesn't impress me as much as the location. You know, and so I see that in some fields that make a lot of money, doctors, you know, other people who are engineers and things like that. Like you said, they'll telecommute or they'll work out of their office or their home in a nice place like this, and then they'll maybe commute somewhere for 3 or 4 days a week. So those types of things you can do it with, but not with planning. You got to kind of be there in the trenches. And so that transient population kind of works against the entire thing. You know, if somebody comes in and they can't actually interpret that law the same way, everybody's at risk. And that's what jeopardizes economic development here.
It seems like a lot of our problem that we have related with this particular code is that I think it's been said in meetings that the process, they didn't have public input, a lot of aspects of it didn't happen the way maybe it should have. Well, what has happened to me is once it got proposed and people started looking at it, then it became, wait a minute, what's in that?
That's correct.
And they didn't even, most of them did not even know what was in the previous code.
And that's precisely
So
right.
the whole thing is new and like, wow,
Right.
how did this ever happen?
That's precisely right. And it's funny because when I first went in and I talked to some of the people in the office, and they're all hardworking. Everybody's hardworking.
Oh, yeah.
But I have this issue that I brought up, which was the grant proposal itself. Once you go back, you know what? It's just research. I'm just a really good researcher because I used to be a PI 20-some years ago. And before that, I was in the military and I had to do briefings, and you had to know your stuff. You basically had to know it, all right? And so the argument against the old code being recycled without change at this point is that they identified the existing code was inadequate, and it also conflicted with itself. They identified that when they did this grant proposal and sent it out in 2014. And so that's something that I think people didn't realize because we've had so many people flip. We've had such a high turnover. So a lot of people, I don't think, even looked at the original grant proposal. They may not have looked at that. And the funny thing about that, here's this interesting fact. I didn't bring this up there. The grant proposal itself was sped through. Staff released it with the mayor signing it, and city council didn't even have a chance to look at the grant proposal before it went out. So that's something that people, I think have kind of swept under the rug. So we had old code that was bad. Now, people have been building houses here for 1,000 years, right? They've been using some form of common sense. I don't think zoning, or actually I don't think real planning came in until about 98 in Montezuma County. I'm not sure that
That was the county code.
Right, the county code. And so I don't know exactly where that fits with Cortez, but I can tell you that if code compliance officers have looked at the code and said, yeesh, I'm not touching that. That's just, my kid's got to go to school with this guy's kids. I'm not going to enforce this. This is too strange. It's too weird. We have laws in the books that cops won't enforce, I mean, straight up, they're not stupid. They look at this and they say it's not in the public interest. So we've had so much code in Cortez that's not in the public interest. At this time, we need to first identify that. We need to get a process. And that's kind of my call to action as people going forward, they need to have the concept of information drives the fight. They need to be informed. And they need to, maybe meet an hour a week in person with friends and discuss the issue. But the goal for this code right now should be to reduce it before you update it, to use data from enforcement and use a transparent and fair process and go through and say, look, this week we're kicking out this much code. Every 2 weeks, people meet at city council. They should see new proposals for stuff that's going out the door, okay? If it hasn't been enforced now, probably not something people need to have. And then we build it up. It's just like if you have a cracked slab for your foundation, or any other thing you have where something's, you got to salvage some of it, but, you don't want to tear the whole thing down, right, which would be get rid of the old code as well. So we don't want to get rid of the old code completely, but by using data and finding out what's been enforced and what's not, we have a clear and transparent method to communicate to people what's been enforced and what hasn't.
Question for you. As we look at the code and going forward, and we look at how it fits under the Constitution, which we're concerned about, what are the issues, what are the basic things we need to have in a code for us to be able to live next door to each other? What are we talking about? I think it's health and safety.
Right.
Period.
And that's where I think people sometimes they split up what they consider to be health and safety. Sometimes they consider that their health and safety is the safety of the growth of their portfolio, and their portfolio's largest asset is their home. And so that's sometimes where people say, what you're doing down there is going to impact me, and it's going to impact the value of my home. And I'm not probably stating it exactly how people have stated it in the past, but it's almost like an HOA kind of a thing. People all want to have the same exact cookie cutter kind of approach. You can't do that in a multicultural place. Okay, Cortez has got hipsters, it's got cowboys, it's got probably 3 or 4 different kinds of not just Dene, not just Ute, but you've got Southern Ute, Mountain Ute. You've got, probably I think 30 or 40 different clans of Navajo. You've got people from Utah, and that is completely separated by the San Juan River than you do from the rest of the Navajo Nation, okay? So everybody's got their own concept on what is going to increase the value of their biggest asset, their home. And so trying to come in and say, hey, this is how we want everything to look.
But you see, that's a false premise.
Yeah.
Number one, the only impact that government regulation can have on property value is negative. Okay? Period.
It's going to cost you money whether you see it in the first place or not. I agree.
Government can do nothing to increase the value of my house. It's not possible.
Or even preserve the value.
Even preserve it. They can't. The only thing they can do is decrease it through regulation and mandates. The second thing is this whole thing about property value is a false perception. What I value my property at might be my dream.
Yep.
If you're buying it,
that's the
you
market
may
price.
have a different concept of what my property is worth.
That's exactly right.
So
yeah.
in a free association society where you and I get to discuss what my house is worth, and I say this and you say that, and maybe we can meet somewhere.
You nailed it. I think you nailed it, Bud. And the other side is that's exactly why people retain realtors in the first place. They want somebody who's an advocate, who's a professional. Because how many times are you going to do such a big asset purchase of a home? It used to be people would buy it and hold it for 30 years. It'd be paid off, well, in 20, I should say. It used to be 20 years you could pay off your home.
Yeah.
And so to have those two realtors kind of trying to work out all the details because they're professionals, those are people who actually should have been included in the whole code process, and they've made themselves known pretty well. And I think that's one of the assets that we have to creating new code is that taking the old code and handing it off to the realtors like they have the new code and having them look at each section and say this works, this doesn't, would be something that kind of equals that out a little bit between the buyer and the seller, right? Because they have an interest of buyers and sellers. And so I think you did a great job with her. That's good.
Okay, you two. Where do we go from here?
What do you think?
Specifically with the proposed code, it needs to go away. It doesn't need what was in the paper this morning to pause so that we can have better community buy-in. Now, that was the newspaper's words. If I take that literally, what it means is we on city staff have not been able to convince enough people that this is a good deal. So we need to work harder on our propaganda, which is what's going to happen. This code that's proposed cannot be fixed. It is a dictatorial, full confiscation of my property rights. I could not do anything at my house that a bureaucrat could not label a material change. That's required in the code. A material change requires you to come up to code. Now, my neighbor across the street has a front door, had a front door that was parallel to the street. Somebody in the past built a little portico, like a little, I mean, it's not a big mud room or anything, but it faces 90 degrees from the street.
An add-on. That makes sense.
It's a little add-on.
Yeah, but it's useful.
It's fine.
It's got its uses. That's
Yeah,
where you're
you
gonna
kick your boots off
You kick
there.
your boots off,
Okay.
exactly.
If he were to go, maybe he wants a project someday in the future, and he goes to get a permit, that would have to go away because it does not face the street.
Or be modified, which would cost money either way.
He would have to completely re-side his vinyl siding house. That has to go away because vinyl siding is no longer allowed under this code. There's no such thing as vinyl siding that looks like brick. It ain't happening, okay? So vinyl siding would be outlawed in the city of Cortez.
Right.
So anyway, this code needs to be killed now. On the 28th. No more pause, no more delayed votes. Make a stand. City council members, vote no. Have some spine. Get rid of this thing. And then direct. Okay, right now we have a backwards city government. Staff is telling city council what to do.
I've noticed that.
That's backwards.
Yeah.
City council members, get a backbone. Tell staff, if you can't prove that your idea is health and safety related in its strictest construct, then we ain't doing it, and you don't get to propose it, and if you do, you're down the road. You can go kick rocks some other place. Okay? We need some discipline from city council on the folks that proposed this. They say the folks wrote it, which I don't believe. I saw too much of it was cut and paste. The folks that proposed this need to go down the road. They should not have a government job of any authority. If this is their thinking, so antithetical to our Constitution, both at the federal and the state level, if they don't know any better, they have no business being in a governing body. And city council, this one or the one we elect in April, needs to get some backbone, get rid of this now, and get rid of the staff that proposed it because they are anti-American based on what I read when we opened this session. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it and say that they were uninformed or misinterpreted. No, They are anti-American. Let's say it. Let's be a community that abides by our founding rules of the game and get rid of those that don't want to play right.
I think you've got the right idea on this, and I was just going to mention the concept that maybe people were misinformed is what I first started out with. And I probably wouldn't agree with every single point you make, but I will tell you that I think probably about 80% of what you just said I agree with, because I came in thinking, well, maybe they're misinformed. And as I started flipping
No, I'm
through
not
things,
talking about the public being misinformed.
no,
about
I'm talking
the
about
code.
I'm talking about the planners. I thought they were misinformed, and so I looked at it and I said, maybe they don't know about these other processes. Maybe they don't know what the risks of Euclidean zoning are concerning racism or classism or things like that.
That doesn't matter.
Right. Well, what happened was, as I went through my, I guess you could call it my research, my due diligence, I found out that they had processes in place put in by another planner, and for some reason, and I can tell you honestly, and I tell you, I put my defense investigator hat on, okay? I can't prove beyond the shadow of a reasonable doubt that the planners were decided to do this. I can say that I see enough influence from the mayor, and she leaves, I think, probably in 2 months. But I can see enough influence from the mayor at all levels that the planners may have been directed by the mayor in a formal or informal manner. And so they may not have this may not have been their baby. They may have been directed to basically, this is your job, and you're going to do this, and that's going to be the way it is. I don't get the concept or feeling that they were 100% behind it. At the same time, that doesn't mean that you just get the right to do carte blanche and not follow a good procedure that was already laid out when you got the grant. That's the important thing. The procedure to go ahead and handle all this was already set up and promised to the people who invested by giving grant money.
But if you take a government job, any government job in any department, you take an oath.
Right.
Okay?
To the Constitution.
To the Constitution of the United States and
the state.
The state of Colorado. Now, the oath changed 2 years ago to a totally egregious oath. It is a terrible oath now because you take an oath to protect, defend, uphold, whatever, Constitution of the United States, Constitution of the state of Colorado, and the law. That's in the code now. That's in the oath now.
That can conflict, can't it?
That very often does conflict. But if you take that oath, when you take a government job as a city planner, you must inform yourself of what our founding documents are. And if what you think doesn't fit, quit thinking that way because you are violating your oath.
Well, I guess
Friend of
maybe
mine.
we could.
I got to get this. Friend of mine.
Okay.
A friend of mine had a proposal for all elected and appointed government officials. Upon taking office, they would wear a collar.
Shot collar?
No, explosive collar.
Oh, nice.
And this collar would have the ability to determine that you are violating your oath of office. Kablooey.
Self-solving problem.
Well, we don't have any of those collars, so let's kind of bring this to a summation of what the discussion is the code. Well, first of all, our Constitution lays out the rules how to set up government and operation, maintaining our private property rights, which is the very foundation of what we have. And within those, how do we do it? We get together and set codes of I guess you mean, for our society that deal with our health and our safety and not infringing on my neighbor's health and safety. And very basic, very similar. And we got a code now that the old code was bad. The new code proposal built on top of a bad one is even worse. So the solution is what? Has just been said, end it. Swallow the bitter pill and say we screwed up. And say we start over again. and then go back to the very founding fathers. It's in the Constitution. How do we set it up? New rules that abide by our health and our safety, and not whether the color of my house is.
Mm-hmm.
And go from there, but with a group that understands what our rules are. And meeting so that we can get along with each as neighbors. We're not going to conflict. Yeah, you want your green house and I want my purple house.
Mm-hmm.
So be it.
Yep.
You're a pretty good guy anyway. So if we can encourage the city council to vote this thing down, and we have an opportunity to really build a really cool community that meets all of the groundwork of our founding fathers, and let's go from there. Thank you, Charles, for being with us, and we wish you the best as you're going on. We hope
Thank
to
you very
see
much.
you back.
Absolutely. I'll check in from time to time, and I've already given my email address out to plenty of people, including those on planning committee. If there's anything I can do to help going forward, I really hope so. And I want to stress, people should show up on the 28th, even if you just yield time or just pick one issue that resonates with you and speak up. Just say one thing. And I put the presentation together so people could pick and choose some of the things I found, see if they resonated, and use those. The other thing is, going forward, information drives the fight. Meet 1 hour a week in person with your friends. Dedicate yourself. The people watching this show, I'm sure there are times you get a chance to meet with people. My mom does Bible study, for example, or something like that. And try to make sure you meet and talk about the things that are happening in Cortez. Keep your finger on the pulse. Keep informed, because it's when we kind of set it and forget it, we have issues like this that sneak past. And I do want to say thank you. I think it was Dave Waters and his family, Tiffany Waters, her husband Sheldon, and his wife. They stood in the gap. All right. And I don't think I had a chance to say this earlier when I was in city council, but without them, things would be very different in Cortez. And I hope people remember that. They were dedicated to that. I don't think there's any way to emphasize that we all can do what Dave Waters did. We all can go out there, find out what's going on, stay educated, give feedback, and then bring it to public awareness. I think that was a great job that they did, and I'm proud to now count them as my friends. You know, I think they're good people. They're good people. Yeah.
They're good people.
That demonstrates the diversity of our community
Mm-hmm.
and people and ideas, and that's what we want to preserve.
Correct.
Look at how easy this is. I knew Dave when he had one backhoe and went around digging up busted risers.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's Dave Waters. And he and his wife and daughter looked into this, and they understood it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, I'm not saying that they're simple people. What I'm saying is they are normal, regular people.
Which is America. Exactly.
That's us.
Right.
You can do that.
Correct.
We at the 912, we study the Constitution, if that's not obvious to anybody. We're not lawyers or anything like that. We just look at it, and here's what the word says. And here's what the word meant in 1787.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we do, because it might be different. But anyway, this is not impossible for mom and pop sitting in the living room on a Wednesday afternoon.
Correct. And you just have to take time out. It doesn't serve any purpose to fight with somebody on Facebook. You know, I've seen that cartoon where it says somebody's wrong on the internet as the guy fiercely types. You know, it's that helps, but there's you've heard the saying cyberspace, right? Well, there's something called meet space. That's like this. Get out in real life and meet with people, because we pick up so many different cues just having this conversation and looking at your face that brings 1,000 times more reality for what's going on.
Well, Dexter tried to get us to shut up.
Be sure we'll kick it back to you, Dexter. Thank you very much.
I'm pretty sure we're beyond what we, we don't have an allotted time.
Right.
But we try to keep it short because folks lose interest. So,
Yeah.
We're well over what we had. We said we could do this in 15 minutes.
No, we didn't. We knew it wouldn't happen.
We've done 16.
You guys haven't met me before, have you?
We've only done it twice in 15
I'm ready for
minutes.
another show, another glass of water. We can do another tape for next week.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for being with us, Charles. And hope you guys will be back with us next time. Good night.
nervous. You know, it's
You're all right for a student.